Okay, what is up there YouTube? This is J-Ben Time, and today I have yet another video on yet another forgotten project, this time from the First World War. Actually, this project kind of predates World War I by a few weeks or a few days, but a project from the First World War altogether. And this project here was the first true Russian tank ever developed for the Imperial Russian Army or armed forces during the very start or at the very beginning of World War I, and this vehicle here goes down in history as one of the first true tanks or tank-like armored fighting vehicles to ever be developed in the 1910s. And that vehicle is the Vezdekhod, the first true Russian tank and also the world's first true light tank to ever make it to the prototype stage and off the drawing boards. Now, the Vezdekhod was an experimental light tank / tankette-like vehicle that was developed in 1914-1915 by a Russian engineer by the name of Alexander Porokhoshchikov. Porokhoshchikov was living in what is now known as Latvia and Riga, Latvia at the time, and actually submitted his design for a light, fast armored fighting vehicle to the Imperial Russian High Command. Now, later on, the High Command would send one of their colonels, Colonel Pokolevsky Kozelo, to supervise the construction of this armored fighting vehicle. And the first prototype of the Vezdekhod would be constructed in the first half of the year of 1915, a few months after World War I had already started. Now, the project actually began in August of 1914 when the 23-year-old Russian aircraft engineer Alexander Porokhoshchikov submitted his design to the Russian High Command, and by January of 1915, the first technical drawings were completed, and by December of 1915, the first fully functioning prototype, or at least the fully functioning hull without the turret of the Vezdekhod, was submitted and tested by the Imperial Russian Armed Forces. Now, design-wise, this is one of the strangest of the early Russian tanks, as when you think of a tank, you normally think of a tank or a vehicle with two sets of tracks, but the Vezdekhod only had one singular large track at the base or center of the tank at the ground level. Now, this track was actually a large single track made of rubberized fabric that stretched over 4 large drum cylinder type wheels, along with a 5th wheel that acted as a tension. And there was also a 6th wheel, which was the main wheel that was actually propelling the vehicle. The vehicle was powered by a 10 horsepower or 7.5 kilowatt 2-cylinder petrol engine, which gave the vehicle a maximum speed of 42.6 kilometers per hour or 26.5 miles per hour. Now, the vehicle was supposed to be armed with a single turret, fitted with one 7.62mm PM Maxim Model 1910 medium/heavy machine gun, which was the standard machine gun used by the Imperial Russian Armed Forces at the time. And it had a very advanced armor layout for this time. The internal armor thickness, or the armor thickness of the main portion of the vehicle, was only 2mm. Porokhoshchikov came up with a new type of sloped armor or angled armor, which was an additional 8mm armored shell that formed the basis of the outer portion of the vehicle. The curved outer portion of the tank's hull is that 8mm armored shell, with the original square-shaped inner hull being only 2mm thick. So in a way, this was the first tank prototype to have what we would now call spaced armor, which is 2 separate layers of armor with a gap in between them. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the tank mostly ran on a large single track, but there were actually 2 wheels that were placed on the sides of the track that could be lowered, just like many of the experimental wheeled tanks that you would see during the interwar years. These wheels could be lowered in order for the vehicle to drive on solid roads or paved roads. The wheels could be retracted and the tank could run on its singular track when traversing on soft ground or most rocky/hilly terrain. This made the Vezdekhod one of the more advanced tank projects of the early part of World War I, as most tanks at this time period were literally just tractors with armored boxes slapped onto them. That includes the early model British Mark Is and many of the experimental French tanks, with the exception of the Renault FT-17, from that time period. So Vezdekhod was pretty advanced as it had both a track and a wheel system. It was basically the first wheeled come tank, or the first wheeled track tank, which we would see more of later on during the 1920s and 30s, during the interwar era of the 1920s and 30s, although the wheel come design would never become popular even after World War I. It was largely scrapped by the beginning of World War II, although some vehicles did have this design, but most didn't. But the Vezdekhod was technically the first tank to have a wheel come system, a wheel track system that allowed the vehicle to run both on paved roads with its wheels and on rough terrain with its track system. Now, the tank was tested between May of 1915 and December of 1915. And during these tests, the Russian Military Technical Department, which was part of the Russian High Command at the time, concluded that the vehicle was very good as it had passed most of its tests, but at the same time they considered it to be too advanced or too complicated for mass production or for service. So the project was actually canceled at the end of 1915. Now, later on, in October of 1916, the project was revived for a second time, but by this point, the Russian military was in disarray after having lost so many battles against the Imperial German and Austro-Hungarian forces during the fighting on the Eastern Front. And on top of that, they were suffering from a lack of funding due to all of the political chaos that was happening in Russia at the time. Keep in mind that this was just before the start of the October Revolution, which would later lead to the Russian Civil War, which would later lead to the rise of the newly formed Soviet Union later on in 1917 through 1923. And at this time, the Imperial Russian Armed Forces were looking for new armored fighting vehicles to help push back the Central Powers forces that were annexing large amounts of Imperial Russian territory at this time. So the Vezdekhod was one of the vehicle projects they were trying to resurrect in the hopes that it could be used as a weapon against the German and Austro-Hungarian and Bulgarian forces at this time. But ultimately, the project was cancelled for a second time by the end of 1916. Now, later on, between 1916 and 1917, Alexander Porokhoshnikov came up with a second concept for the Vezdekhod. This was known as the Vezdekhod 2 that was developed on paper between 1916 and 1918. This second prototype had 2 extra machine guns fitted into a double revolving turret. The second Vezdekhod also had a reduced armor thickness of just 8mm and a reduced speed of just 14.7 kilometers per hour or 9.1 miles per hour, but it had an increased crew capacity of 3 to 4. This second Vezdekhod project was submitted to the Russian High Command between 1916 and 1917, but the Russian High Command completely rejected this project, mainly due to the fact that the vehicle was slower and the fact that its turret system, which was meant to house 3 to 4 operators at a time, was simply too small and too cramped. Also, they didn't like Porokhoshnikov's redesign of the Vezdekhod's hull for the second prototype, viewing the entire project as being too complicated and too unrealistic for production or for use by the Imperial Russian Armed Forces. So by 1918, the Vezdekhod 2 project was basically cancelled and rejected, although it is unknown if an actual prototype was built. Some sources state that there was never a prototype completed for the Vezdekhod 2, while some other sources state that there was at least one working mock-up prototype for the Vezdekhod 2, but it is unknown if any of these sources are actually true. So the Vezdekhod 2 was either not constructed at all, or at least one partial prototype was completed before the start of the Russian Civil War in 1918. And that basically is the history of the Vezdekhod project. Now, after World War I and during the Russian Civil War, a lot of the Soviet-era media began to promote the Vezdekhod as the first true tank, coming after the end of World War I, where tanks like the British Mark I were promoted by Western media as the first true tank. Now, it is true that the Mark I was the first tank to enter service, but neither the Mark II or the Vezdekhod were really the first true tanks, as there were tons of other experimental tanks that were being developed before World War I. For example, the Austro-Hungarian Motorgeschütz tank from 1911. But you could say that the Vezdekhod was the first true tank to be completed or to be built, as the first prototype was built in early 1915, while the first prototypes for the Mark I British tanks were not completed until the end of 1915. So I guess you could say the Vezdekhod was actually the first true tank to be tested, at least in the prototype stage or the prototype form, was one of the first tanks to actually be completed, although it was rejected ultimately by the Russian High Command. Now, in terms of its potential, if the Vezdekhod had entered service in, say, 1916, if it had not been cancelled at the end of 1915, and production had begun in, say, early to mid-1916, it could have been very useful against the German and Austro-Hungarian and Bulgarian and even the Ottoman forces that were all annexing parts of Russian and Russian allied territories at that point in 1916. Now, in 1916, Russia was losing huge amounts of territory to the Central Powers, especially later on in the year of 1917, where all of countries like Ukraine, Belarus, Finland, Latvia, Estonia were now basically controlled by German and Austro-Hungarian forces. And the situation was also getting bad on the Ottoman front line, where Ottoman forces were also pushing the Russians back in places like Persia, for example, or what we would now call Iran, for example, as there was fighting between the Ottomans and the Russian forces inside of Iranian territory. So on those front lines, a light, fast armored fighting vehicle, all-terrain armored fighting vehicle like the Vezdekhod would have been very useful in pushing back the German, Austro-Hungarian, Bulgarian, and Ottoman forces that were advancing onto Russian territory towards the middle and end of World War I. And it also would have been useful in the Russian Civil War. Imagine if the Vezdekhod had been used during the Russian Civil War by either the White forces or the Bolshevik forces. It is unknown what actually happened to the original Vezdekhod prototype. The prototype seems to have been lost to history after the start of the Russian Civil War in 1917-1918. Many historians assume that the tank was actually used in combat at some point at the very beginning of the Russian Civil War by either the Bolshevik forces or the White Russian forces, as both sides were using many of the leftover vehicles from the Imperial Russian Army of the First World War, along with many experimental tanks that were developed during the Russian Civil War, like the Freedom Fighter Lenin, which was a copy of the Renault FT-17, and the Clayton tank, which was a White Russian experimental tractor tank from 1919. But it is unknown if the Vezdekhod was actually used in the Russian Civil War, but I would assume there might have been. It was a fully functioning prototype, and it was armored. All it needed was a machine gun turret, and that was basically it. So yeah, there you have it. The Vezdekhod 1 and its proposed the Vezdekhod 2, the first true Russian tank projects developed at the very start of World War I. And technically, if you talk about the Vezdekhod 2, it was developed at the very start, technically, of the Russian Civil War, although it is unknown if the prototype was actually built or not. But the Vezdekhod goes down in history as one of the first tanks ever developed, and it also goes down in history as Russia's first tank. All tanks developed in Russia now are basically descendants of the Vezdekhod. A very strange light tank that could be considered the world's first tank yet also. Many don't think about it, the Vezdekhod actually does resemble the concept of many interwar era tankets like the Soviet T-23 and the Polish TKS tankets, for example. So you could call this the first Russian tank. It could also be considered the world's first tanket and one of the world's first light tanks to ever be built. The Vezdekhod 1 and 2 experimental tanks of 1914 and 1916. So what do you all think of this? Please tell me in the comment section below. And until next time, this was J-Man Time signing off.